Hi, everyone. This is Roger Russell in Feldenkrais First Central, and we're talking to our roving reporter, Andrew Gibbons. And this week, Andrew's at the Marlboro Music Festival in Vermont. And we're going to talk to Andrew. What's he doing here? And where is it? And what's it like? And what's Feldenkrais got to do with that level of music? Because from what he's told me and from what I've read, this is really a high level musical festival and basically a summer camp for top professional musicians and interns that are on their way up. So, hi, Andrew. So, welcome to Feldenkrais First Roving Reporter.
Offsite. Yeah, I'm up here on a mountaintop in Vermont, just outside of Brattleboro, which is about 10 miles across the border from Massachusetts. And the Marlboro Festival is probably the oldest chamber music festival in the United States.
Mhm.
And it really is they have ticketed concerts for the public that start later in July. I think they start on the 13th of July this year. So I'm here during the period when the musicians are rehearsing and preparing the music for the first concerts. They're rehearsing and preparing throughout, but this is the period of time before the concerts begin. So yeah, it's called the Marlboro Music Festival because it's in the town of Marlboro, and it's a very small town. There's probably 1,200 people up on this mountain, and the college, Marlboro College, was founded back after World War II. Two GIs came back, and they used their GI Bill money to build this small liberal arts college up on top of the mountain. And eventually, they heard that the pianist Rudolf Serkin had a summer home up here, and they went and asked him if he would give a public concert to help fundraise for the college, and he said no. So these two guys
Sounds successful.
they just went ahead anyway. They just put it in the paper that he was going to give a concert, and so they just pushed him, and eventually, of course, it did happen. And the violinist Adolf Busch, who was also a playing partner of Serkin's, also had his summer. He takes summers up here, and that's really how the festival got started. But for the last 60, 70 years, I think they just had their 70th anniversary a few years ago. Marlboro is really a place where elite musicians come to learn from the different generations of professionals. They divide things into what they call the juniors and the seniors. So the seniors are really late career professionals, and the juniors are more early and mid-career professionals. And the musicians, they decide what the repertoire is going to be for the concerts. And the musicians decide how long they're going to rehearse the piece. And when they feel it's ready, then they submit it to go on one of the concerts here. And if you buy tickets to a concert, you don't know. You don't
What
know
you're in
what to
for.
hear.
Yeah, that's what I saw on
They
the
really do
website.
decide moment to moment what
Yeah.
they're ready to perform.
So for the people coming to the concerts, it's an adventure as much as it is for the musicians.
Yeah, it's really kind of a nice ethos because what you're going to hear is what the musicians really believe in. You're not buying your tickets months in advance, and you're not buying it based on, oh, I like Beethoven, but I don't like Debussy, I don't like 20th century music. And so very often there's this surprise of getting to hear composers you might not have otherwise heard,
Mhm.
but you're going to hear them played by people at the very top of the game.
Okay.
And it's a
So
beautiful place to come to a concert because there's nothing else going on here except the festival and this little college facility. So to come to the concert, you park your car and you're really walking up on a mountaintop, and you can see out over the valley and the rest of Vermont. And that's what you go into the concert hall with that still fresh in your nose, and then you come out from the concert and you're in that environment. So
wow, sounds wonderful.
yeah.
So so that's where you are and a little bit of the history. How did you end up there? What's your story there?
Well, I've been coming up here this is our 16th year coming up. And I was invited to come up. Richard Good, who's one of the great living pianists, was a client of mine for a period of time, and Richard had worked with another Feldenkrais teacher, and then that teacher referred him to me, and Richard eventually invited me and my family to come up for a week in the summer. And so Richard is no longer one of the artistic directors. He retired from that post a few years ago. But the two artistic directors are now Mitsuko Uchida, another one of the great living pianists, and also Jonathan Biss, who's a younger generation, but also an absolutely wonderful musician. So we were invited to come up to give both awareness through movement classes and functional integration lessons during the day. So, musicians like anybody that does a highly skilled art or sport or any kind of behavior, it's not easy. And so they are what the pianist Leon Fleischer called small muscle athletes. That's the way Leon Fleischer referred to musicians. Leon Fleischer was, he was another one of the great pianists of the 20th century who he crippled his right hand from the way he played the piano, actually. And I met Leon Fleischer at Tanglewood. I was at the Tanglewood Festival when I was 16, and I think again when I was 18. Fleischer had crippled his right hand playing the piano, so he was somebody who was quite familiar with the threat of injury that a lot of high-performing musicians face. And when I was 16 at Tanglewood, Fleischer was the artistic director of Tanglewood, and he had invited a Feldenkrais teacher to come to that festival. That's where I first experienced Feldenkrais. Oh. And so now here we are.
The circle's closed back on itself.
Yeah. A few decades down the road. Yeah.
Right. So what you're saying, though, and you haven't admitted it yet, that you are a high-level musician yourself.
Well, I'm a conservatory trained pianist, but I try to keep a low profile here. I don't try to wear that on my sleeve. I try to sneak away to find a piano where I can work on some spiritually satisfying things, but I don't perform anymore. But it's a thrilling environment just to be around, because walking to lunch, you're going to overhear rehearsals that are going on in one or another of the buildings that they have here. And it's very small and intimate. So you can, you'll pass a Brahms sextet going on in one room, and you'll find your way to the, Ravel trio in the next, another 50 yards down the road. So
that must be wonderful if you spent your life doing music. Yeah.
It's really nourishing to be around. They work very hard. The musicians it's an up at dawn thing here. And they're also, of course, they're all preparing for the concerts that are coming. So everybody's aware of the time factor. But I give a awareness to movement class every morning at 7:15 in the morning. And then during the day, I have slots for 4 or 5 lessons for the musicians to come and have private sessions with me. But it's rather interesting working with professional musicians, because they're extremely sensitive to what they're doing. But it doesn't always mean that they're extremely sensitive to the way they use their body. If they have their instrument in their hand and they have a certain way that they're trying to express the music, there they are. You're just dealing with a Formula One race car driver. But in the way they walk, the way they sit, they don't necessarily have some incredible high-level training in the simple acts of support and coordination in other realms. And of course, that's where we all run into trouble.
Right. Well, that's interesting, because you could call me a serious non-musician.
Meaning you like to listen.
My 5th grade piano teacher suggested to my mother that it might be good if I took up the drums. In other words, get this kid out of my room.
Don't make him play something in tune.
She said nicely, he's got good rhythm, but his ear for melody. And
well, the world needs drummers too. So
yeah. That's not what I ended up doing. But you brought up a couple of interesting things. There's three things. First of all, what was your pathway from your music? What got you involved in it? Your training? You got to Tanglewood, you got to Marlboro, and you got to Feldenkrais. So how did these different lines of your life come to be intertwined so that now you're there teaching?
Well, I didn't get serious about piano until I was about 15 or 16. I didn't get
Okay.
serious about piano until I wound up at Tanglewood. I had no idea really what Tanglewood was. Um,
Uh,
I think I was probably just a musical kid. Uh,
mm,
Family was fairly musical. My brothers played instruments well. My piano teacher at the time just said, you should just go for the summer to one of these camps. You're really ready to have a kind of a deeper experience.
mhm.
And I didn't even listen to classical music. I just took piano lessons, and I
Oh,
could introduce a few pieces, but I wasn't steeped in musical culture, and certainly not in classical culture.
mhm.
And when I got to Tanglewood and realized the level of the other students, I just about tried to buy myself a bus ticket home. It was very intimidating. And of course,
Uh-huh.
Tanglewood has a very rich, long history. There's a program for the high school students that's sponsored usually by Boston University. There's a fellowship program for college talented college age musicians and early career professionals, and then it's the summer home for the Boston Symphony.
Right.
So Tanglewood was really when my musical world just exploded outward. I suddenly realized, wow, there's a whole world of people that do this incredible art at such a high level, and I was there for 2 months. Uh,
Wow.
but it was also the summer that I was introduced to Feldenkrais because the teacher who had been I think she'd been hired to work with the Boston Symphony, the musicians of the symphony. Again, Leon Fleischer, who was well aware of the problems with you know small muscle athletes that they that they tend to have. The teacher came and gave a workshop for the high school students. It was just an afternoon workshop, and I just happened to walk by a friend of mine who was on his way there. He was a singer. They didn't have to practice so many hours as the rest of the instrumentalists. And so they had all these ancillary workshops that they would go to. And he said, "Do you want to come to this posture workshop?" And I knew I had pretty bad posture. I was like an athletic kid, but after I sort of started spending more time playing music, you just sit all the time, and you don't get a lot of advice about how to sit well. You're just told sit up straight or get your shoulders back or whatever you're told. And I went and I just found the workshop very practical. It just seemed to me a kind of an educational way in to understanding how coordination and movement could work. And I found that pretty much anything the teacher asked us to pay attention to, I could do it. I could pay attention and I could feel the difference that she was asking us
Wow.
to. It didn't mean I became, perfectly comfortable or coordinated, but I
Mhm.
think I was actually intellectually quite interested in it too, because I was aware of how inadequate I felt at the piano in general, and was of course looking for something that would help me.
Mhm.
But the other powerful thing was the teacher actually worked with some of the high school students at their instruments on stage,
Wow.
and sort of worked with them in a kind of a functional integration context, not on a table, but actually worked with them as they were playing and asked them to
Mhm.
experiment with certain things. And that really got my attention.
Oh,
Um,
yeah.
I knew one of the pianists that she worked with, and the change that happened in about 20 minutes, it was really hard not to notice that and go, wow.
Mhm.
Because in that environment where at Tanglewood, you're in a master class situation. Students are getting up and performing a piece in front of the group. The teacher, you're basically having a public piano lesson in front of everyone. You're doing that
Mhm.
5 hours a day.
Wow.
So you're learning repertoire, and you're also learning
Conditioning,
about, say again.
athletic conditioning, small muscle athletic conditioning.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you're really training. You're learning what it means to make decisions at the piano too. But
Mhm.
the other thing is you also get a sense of what everybody plays like.
Uh-huh.
typically people come to those situations really prepared to play. You're not bringing pieces that aren't really polished. And
Right.
so by that point, I really knew, if you were there, I would know what Roger's Beethoven Waldstein Sonata sounds like. I hear him practicing it down the hall every day, right? I really know what your sort of your strengths are, your weaknesses are, because you're just around it a lot. And what I saw with this woman that went on stage to work with the Feldenkrais teacher was um, the transformation was relatively quick. These are talented kids, don't get me wrong. I mean, she's a smart person. But the things that the teacher did with her at the piano were like nothing you would ever see in a piano lesson,
Uh-huh.
because it
Okay.
was all built around how she physically related to the instrument and how she supported herself, and getting her basically to challenge her notions of what she might do in the spirit of practicing or improving.
Mhm.
And the change in the way she played it was breathtaking. She went from basically somebody who could play the piece, was a little bit tied up, and it was she, experienced difficulty playing it, and some of the articulation didn't come off so well, and that's standard. And at the end, after she played it the second time, she played for about 8 to 12 measures, and it was like pouring water out of a glass. It came out just so uh, I don't know how to describe it, but just pouring water out of a glass. It was so good that the pianist actually stopped in the middle. She just stopped, and like her hand sort of came up, and the teacher said, "Why'd you stop it? It sounded so much better." And she said, "It can't be this easy." Now, it was a genuine
That's classic
comment.
film. Yes.
Yeah, it's exactly very similar. The person realizes a kind of a staggering improvement.
Yeah.
And they got rid of something that was so in the way that they had no insight into. And it was also something where, having watched pianists and of course struggled myself in the practice room to try, you're by yourself practicing a lot. You're hacking away at it. But to see somebody improve so much and so soon, and to comment that it was actually so much easier to play, this also speaks to there's some intuition that you have, that great artists, when you see somebody with truly a virtuoso technique, one of the hallmarks of a virtuoso technique is how much is coming out of the instrument, in contrast to how little it looks like the musician is trying.
Right.
Uh, and that's the definition of a virtuoso technique, is there's such an economy of effort, and yet the expressiveness that's coming out of the instrument, it's almost like they don't match. To hear something that, complex or thundering or whatever, you're expecting somebody to just be tied up in knots with effort. But somebody with truly great, musical sense and technique, there's nothing to see. And it's like a magic trick that's well done. Where just like all the effort, all the work is hidden, so that you're just focusing on the instrument. So that really got my attention. And after the workshop was over, I just thought, well, this seems like something I should know more about. So I just walked to the Lenox bookstore and asked if they had any books by Feldenkrais, and they had Awareness Through Movement, and I bought the book and started reading it. So and that was really the beginning. And then I went to New York City for school. I attended 1 year of conservatory, and then I went to Columbia University for undergraduate. And then I went back to conservatory and did a master's degree in piano performance.
Mhm.
And taking awareness through movement classes was basically how I kept myself relatively functional and healthy through a very difficult period. I basically arrived in New York with an injured hand from the way I played. Um, and so Feldenkrais was kind of this thread that I just kept pulling secretly. And I worked privately with a teacher in New York who was incredibly helpful. And I went to class. I went to awareness and movement class. I had no idea really that I wasn't really talking to anybody about it. I think that was also a rather interesting part of the story. There wasn't anybody I was really sharing it with except for the people in the class and the teacher. It was just kind of this secret wish that I had, that somehow this experience or this information was helping me and figure out how I actually could play rather than how I was supposed to play. So
Wonderful sentence. How I could actually play instead of how I was supposed to play. Yeah.
And I had that experience a few times, actually. So, a lot of classical music is you're being trained in the tradition. You're
Right.
really learning. Conservatory has the word conserve in it.
Hmm.
So there are certain stylistic things and about which you're kind of destined to deal with.
So when was that Tanglewood revelation?
Probably 1986, 87.
Hmm.
And then I went to school in New York in the early 90s. Um, it was kind of funny. I had a few functional integration lessons and I really enjoyed them, but I didn't know why.
Yeah.
The way I describe it to people now, I said, all I can tell you is looking back, I could tell that the way this woman touched me, nobody had ever been that patient with me, including myself. I'd
Huh.
never, I'd never felt that quality of patience or presence in any activity. Certainly not
Mhm.
the piano, right? And she had a piano in her studio because she also taught voice and she played piano herself. And I eventually asked her, I said, can we do what we do on the table here? Can we do that at the piano? And she said, yeah, sure. So we went to the piano and she said, would you like to play something? And I said, is that what I'm supposed to do? I should play. He said, well, you might try just playing something. And I was working on the Prokofiev First Concerto and not having an easy time. The first 4 pages is just all octaves, and then there's a cadenza for the pianist, which was terrifying to me, and so I sort of played it, and she said, "Okay, would you be willing to try something a little differently?" And I said, "Sure." And essentially, she made me make my fingers completely flat. In other words, if this was the piano key, and normally I was playing by touching like this or this, she literally had me lay the finger down completely flat on the key. And every note that I had to play, this was not a musical presentation, obviously, but every note I had to play, I had to feel this whole length of the finger in contact with the key before and during while I pressed it, which is enormously awkward if you think you're trying to play the piano like that. But of course I wasn't. She just said, look, just stay as slow as possible. And each time you have to shift to a note, you just make sure that the entire finger is flat. And I was a good student. I just did what she told me. And it was basically me just sitting there for 10, 15 minutes like this. And looking up occasionally, and she would say, mm-hmm. She maybe touched my back a little bit here or there, or my head a little bit, but nothing intrusive or really instructive because she could see that I was attentive to what I was doing. And, then she said, okay. And she said, try the passage again now. And I understand that I'm telling a story. I'm telling my story. I'm telling a subjective story, but I'm also not lying when I say this, which is that after that, when I played the beginning of the concerto again, I felt like I sounded like a god.
Oh.
Now, I'm not being overly dramatic. All I mean is if you spend thousands of hours in a practice room, you know what it's like to struggle unsuccessfully. And you know when those rare moments when things are going well. And that was a moment where I felt like my hands were twice as big as they normally are. I do not have large hands at all. And it just felt like a landscape which was riddled with issues and danger was just like mine to command in a way that I had never really felt. And of course, she just let me sit there in the kind of the joy of the experience. It wasn't like we talked about it or she explained why
Mhm.
but it totally had my full attention.
Sounds like it. It
Yeah.
gets your attention when you realize, oh, it sounds like, oh, I have this in me.
Yes.
And up to now, my struggle has been getting in the way of letting myself do it
Yes,
in a way.
you're the one of the things that was rather shocking was the lack of this feeling of impotence, right? This, you spend time at the piano, you have a score, these things are difficult, you're already prepped with, oh, these are the great composers, or this person, you listen to someone else play the piece, you know how good it's supposed to sound, you can feel that compared to how you sound.
Mm.
But suddenly it was an experience of just unmitigated power. In other words,
Mhm.
intention, the space between my intention and what I wanted to realize, zero, no space. No
Mhm.
sense of trying to produce, trying to get water to come out of a hose that wouldn't really spray. And, artistically, musically, it was just exhilarating, completely exhilarating.
Mhm.
It's what you imagine might be possible in great art or in great performances or whatever, which was kind of the reason I was there. So
Mm. That's inspiring to hear it. Really, it's wonderful, and you've got a wonderful way of putting words to your experience. That's, I say, I understand. I,
mm,
I I grasp something in what you're saying. Um, the that idea of what you said, it can't be this easy.
mhm,
Woman that you were watching
right.
is such an astonishing discovery that points to something really important in what we're doing, and that is we've got an imagination of how it could be, and then what happens when it doesn't quite work out that way. And if you remove whatever it is that's in the way,
Mhm.
it's available to us. And what that is, of course, skill, but in a level of skill that's astonishing to ourselves sometimes.
Right. There, those moments are where you glimpse a kind of a potential that I would say in that experience, the thing is, it doesn't feel like a potential. It feels like an expression of who you actually are. Like
Yes.
it wasn't as if when I say I played like a god, I don't mean like I played, I don't mean it in an egotistical expression. I mean it in terms of you are so immersed in the experience. Why would you ever try to play the piece? Why wouldn't you just do this, right?
Yeah.
If you have it there. And watching the young woman at Tangwood, part of it also was, you're in a context where you're a piano student, you're learning from the master teacher, you're in an environment, you're aware that the big boys play down the street, and this is where all the advanced high school students, all this kind of thing. Um, the main difference, I don't know that I would have thought this way back then. I was only 16, but the difference between the way she played, I still remember the piece. She played the Bach B flat major prelude from Book Two of the Well-Tempered Clavier. So it's very exposed, fast playing, and
Mhm.
it's the kind of piece that would make a young person nervous to play. There's a lot of treachery going on to some degree. And she was very pianistic and very skilled in the way she played it the first time, but she was also very unsatisfied, and it was a bit of a struggle. And actually, the teacher had asked her to play something that was difficult. It was not success that she was working on, right? She wasn't polished performance, which is I think that's a really great thing to do, actually. In a lot of those situations, if you're in a master class, you don't see the young pianist improve that much because to
Mhm.
get into the master class, they have already had to bring the piece to such a state of finish
Uh-huh.
that what the master teacher works on are certain higher level nuances of musical expression or whatnot.
Mhm.
But here, in the space of 20 minutes, she took the piece from here to there. She took it to a level where, I said that when you know each other because you're around each other a lot, you hear each other's playing. Oh, that's her Schumann Papillon. I know that's going on down the hall. This was like an experience of, oh, that's who she really is. Like it was an artistic experience for the audience of not, wow, that's a talented young pianist. That's not the experience I had. It was like a feeling of like somebody just being revealed in all of their potential. And I think she felt it too, which is why she stopped halfway through and just, she couldn't even recognize herself in some way. I mean, it was a very positive experience. But as somebody who had watched a lot of master classes, those are not the moments you see in a master class. It's not usually that satisfying because the habits of the performance are also fairly well nailed down by that point.
Yeah.
So.
And the habits of the teacher.
And the habits of the teacher. When I look back, it's such a different. It looks like a conversation about how to play the piano better. And in reality, it's actually this incredibly different context than most musical training. Because of course, most music teaching, especially at that level, is about the music and is about the interpretation. But the way of going about it in this situation was so completely through the back door. I mean, she had her wrap her arm around her head and take her elbow and gently sweep it up the keyboard. I mean, we were all sitting there, and I mean, I can only imagine. I must have thought to myself, well, what the hell is this? Like what? That doesn't look like anything you've seen in a piano lesson before. So, but the difference in the sound, you could have been the janitor in the back, and you would have noticed the difference in the two performances.
So kind of the way you talk about it is really great. And the question, of course, comes up, well, how did the teacher draw that out of the student, but how did the student discover how to do that? And why would putting your arm around your head and rubbing on the keys and things like that, what is it in the Feldenkrais approach here that brings out that kind of a difference? And the difference is not just in the expected performance. It's almost like it's a completely different performance, what you're describing in your own experience and what you heard there.
Yeah, I mean, if you're an experienced
different
listener,
idea
it feels like it comes from a different place,
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the one way to sort of describe that, like, so what is it that's going on?
Yeah, sure.
I mean, in one sense, of course, musicians, they use their bodies to do what they do. Of course they do. They use their hands to play the violin. They use their voice to sing. They use their lips to make the embouchure to make the French horn sound. They use their bodies, and most of them have a very clear, specific technique that they have learned, that they have acquired over the years. Mm-hmm. The technique is, of course, centered around a very specific domain of where that technique cashes out well. Mm-hmm. But for the most part, a lot of music teaching doesn't take the rest of the body into the picture,
right,
as far as how that technique is really explained or acquired or refined, unless you work with a truly out-of-bounds kind of teacher. And occasionally people find these stranger music teachers that do different kinds of approaches with them. The music is littered with those kind of teachers. But for the most part, there's a huge amount of the resources that are available in the body. Musician is really not bringing to bear on what they're doing. Now, the fact that these people play it at such an extraordinarily high level is actually not the point. Because there's a confusion that happens among this conversation of, so the right technique is supposed to produce this high level of playing and the bad technique doesn't produce it or something like this. But if you sit with the right people and you watch different musicians perform, what you'll see is that there's a lot of different ways that people play the flute. Now, obviously, there's a lot of similarities. They all put their mouth in the same part of the instrument. They all, but a lot of times what you see with musicians, yes, you are seeing an expression of an incredibly well acquired and refined technique for the instrument. And of course, you're also seeing that person's musical ear which is really the governor of the whole experience. Um, Often, though, what you're seeing is somebody who can do something at a high level in spite of what they do with other parts of their body in the process. Um, I mean, if you think about what a pianist deals with, pianists really do deal with fingers and hands a lot. Like you really are going to be spending an enormous amount of your attentional firepower focused out there in your hands. It's really hard to get very far unless you take that on as a serious project. The problem is there's very often there's nobody to explain or to show you or to introduce you to the ways in which the hands will really suffer and can get injured over time if you don't understand how to include the fact that you have a spine or the fact that you have a rib cage or that you have hip joints or that you have feet that make contact with the ground. These things are often not the subject of music lessons. And some of that is just because there is simply too much to cover about Beethoven. Beethoven is an absolutely bottomless, interesting topic that requires a lot of time and energy. And that's often what the student is paying the teacher for, is that particular knowledge. It's just that there are other domains of skill that actually contribute to the way it feels to play Beethoven. And those are worth exploring, and hopefully before you get injured.
Yeah. Which is unusual, I think.
I think it's unusual too.
I've talked to some here in Germany where I'm Feldenkrais first headquarters is in Germany today. I've talked to a couple of professionals, and they say it's for injury, it's one of the most dangerous professions in the world.
For musicians.
As far as the statistics of how many people have long-term trouble.
Yeah, I mean, if you hang out with professional athletes, right, they'll just tell you, yeah, everybody's got injuries. Like it's just so commonplace. I think the same is probably true for musicians. Of course, there are the rare so-and-so who's just never had an injury or whatever, but this is a difficult profession, a very demanding, takes a lot of time and effort. And if you're also in a place where you get to see those musicians age, well, you also see that process too. And just like the way we age and we get to a place where we can't really walk anymore, musicians go through something similar with their instruments sometimes. It's hard to play, or if somebody has a certain injury, how they respond in that moment to the injury. I worked with a violinist a few years ago, 22 years old, concerto performances lined up from here to next year. Looked like a golf ball had been inserted underneath her bicep, and I don't know whether it was a cyst or it was a tendonitis injury that had really just become, really gotten out of hand. But you're talking about somebody with a lot of pressure on them to perform.
Right.
And it's hard for somebody at these high levels to also think, okay, how much time can I take off? It's just like the pressure athletes feel, where they feel the need to get back in the game as soon as possible. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
The question is, if it takes 20 to 30 minutes to make such a difference in that first demonstration of FI that you saw, how can you afford not to do it? Yeah.
Yeah.
Which is, how can you afford not to find out about a resource that may make a difference between playing hard and playing like God, or like a God, that kind of, that's who I am. That's why I started this. And so there's another question. I don't really know whether we have the time to address it, but we could just continue the talk some other time.
Sure.
About what is it in the Feldenkrais lessons that's so different in the way practicing is imagined, and in the way that practice is integrated. If it's you and the instrument, then what part of you are you paying attention to?
Hmm.
and what happens if you expand your field without losing the instrument or the music,
Hmm.
and how that could possibly work, because your descriptions right now um, show a potential that is hard to imagine if you haven't experienced it or seen it.
It helps to talk to somebody and be able to read about it or hear testimonials
Right.
or a
Sure.
conversation with somebody who's knowledgeable, of course. I think
Yeah.
one of the differences or the reason why Feldenkrais can be so effective, if you take the average high level musician, this is a person with great sensitivity in a particular domain. And I think one of the things that the method exploits is how to turn that same sensitivity into the domain of coordination. Now, the average person listening to this might say, "What do you mean? They're obviously so incredibly coordinated. What else could they?" Well, what we're talking about is, yeah, but they're not so coordinated down in their hip joints, and they're not
Right.
so coordinated in their neck or in their rib cage. And these things, they're not just interesting esoteric ideas. These things are the elephant in the room, actually, for a lot of people.
Mhm.
Um, the idea that it may seem new to somebody who's never experienced Feldenkrais before, had this kind of it's like a compositional approach to the way you're coordinating things.
Right.
It can seem like a new idea or a out of bounds idea or an esoteric idea that, oh my gosh, the ribs move when I move the arm. Yeah, well, evolution thought of that a long, a long, long time ago. But your training may have never really considered it. You may not have ever had the opportunity to really figure out how does that make sense? How does that actually support what I'm doing? Or you may have been told by a teacher, oh, keep your shoulders down, or your shoulders are too high. But the conversation is so short, or it's just a little. You're getting like stop doing that. You're getting a little comment from your teacher of a bad habit, but there's no actual time to understand what that means. And it's this quality of attention that you can actually turn to understand why. Yes, it's a longer conversation than you've had in the past, but it's if you have a house that has beautiful furniture and a great stereo system, and the foundation is completely, you know, in need of renovation, and nobody driving by the house sees that. They just see your pretty house on the block. But at some point or another, that weak foundation is going to cause a lot of that nice furniture to fall into the ground. And
Mhm.
so, while it might not be visible in the normal conversation about how physical function works or what virtuosity looks like or how coordination or strength or flexibility are all these words that people are familiar with, but they're not in a real conversation about the whole composition, so to speak. Um, that stuff really matters. It is the way the injury gets built. That was my experience. Um,
Mhm.
I arrived in New York with a hand injury, and of course, all I could think about was how am I going to how am I
Right.
going to
It's the hand.
make this hand human again, or am I going to have to stretch the fingers? Oh, my fingers are small. That must be why. Da 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 da. You don't realize you're in a conversation. You're not really problem solving. You're just kind of desperate, and you're only pulling on the information that you have at hand. But in 20 years in hindsight, I didn't have a hand problem. I had a sitting problem.
Mhm.
The way I did or didn't organize my pelvis or my spine at the piano, I can show you pictures. That is why my hand became injured. I didn't slam my hand against the piano hard. I just, how much does it take to put the piano key down? It's just a few grams of pressure,
Right.
but it's the conditions, it's the background conditions under which that pressure is
Mhm.
put. I was lucky in that I was injured very early, so I had a lot of time to sort it out.
Right.
I also didn't have a career, so I didn't, I didn't have the pressure of a career and I got interested in Feldenkrais more than anything else, so that was also beneficial. But I was lucky in that I was injured early, and also I met a few interesting people along the way. Leon Fleischer was somebody I met when I was 16. He came and gave a master class for the high school students. And his right hand, he could not play with his right hand, but he would demonstrate the right-handed passages with his left hand. All the fancy stuff that you only play with your right hand. He could do that with his left hand.
Well,
And then at the time, my father was writing for the National Geographic magazine, and he wrote an article on pain. It was just, you can imagine a very sort of National Geographic pain. What is it?
right.
And so he interviewed Fleischer and talked to him a little bit. And Fleischer was very generous with his time, and Fleischer explained to me and to the group of pianists how he thought he injured his hand. He knew how it had happened, and he explained it from the point of view of who he studied with and what they demanded of him and the specifics of the technique and how he understood the technique was wrong in many ways and where it came from and maybe why the teacher emphasized in a certain way, but his ability to grow out of his teacher's, reasoning. And, he had to because it hurt his
Didn't
hand.
work. Yeah.
Didn't work.
Mm.
Exactly. So that's fortunate that I was exposed to a few of those ideas early on, and
Right.
it made me tenacious, and it made me curious, and it made me want to figure out what was it in this method that understood that stuff, that understood some of the problems in the thinking behind that, because I wanted to have as good technique as I could have, but I had an experience early on that made me go, that's not going to be the way you're not going to acquire it by beating yourself
Right.
in the head at the piano. So
Point. Period. It's
yeah.
a very nice way to end the conversation, since you need to actually go back to your next job, something
Somebody's gonna
along
come up the
that
stairs
your
here in 15
schedule.
minutes.
But it's I think it's also a door to another set of conversations about which don't seem to make sense for most people, not just musicians, but generally, why your hips would make a difference for what you're doing with your hands and things like that. And to contextualize that strange idea within a culture that doesn't see that opportunity.
That's right.
A practice culture of experts who are such authorities that they must be right and we're wrong, and running into the opportunity to find out that just taking care of myself might be better than doing the right thing.
Mm.
And then finding a systematic way of taking care of myself
Right.
that lets me, that part of me that's so inspired by the music or whatever else that inspires us. It could be football or all sorts of other things that lets us express ourselves quickly and directly about who we really are. So, because the next question is, of course, it's not accidental, the techniques of the lessons, but they're not based on the usual idea of what practice means at all.
That's
And
another
what is
that is another very big question that I will very much look forward to talking about, which is what really does it mean to practice? Because that word smuggles in a lot of bad ideas.
A lot of effort.
Yeah.
Well, it's just our whole culture. It doesn't matter whether you're playing hockey or playing the piano or learning to write. Practice has a very specific description that actually, admittedly, doesn't work so well. And it's a wonder we learn a lot of things given the fact that we're practicing like we're supposed to. So, good. Great to hear the stories. I'd love to hear some more, actually. It's very nice to hear.
Anytime. It was really lovely to talk to you, Roger.
And everyone who's watching, I personally, Andrew telling his story is very inspiring to me. Yeah. And it brings out a deep respect for his sense of recognizing the aesthetics of, oh, that's important to me, and finding ways to realize that for himself. And that's what we're all looking for, right? Either we're aware of that or we're not, but when we run into it, we recognize it. Yeah. Good. Okay, so have fun up there in Marlboro.
Thanks,
It's a
Roger.
wonderful area. I spent the time in Amherst, which isn't all that far away.
Lots of fun.
And we'll talk another time. I'd love to follow up on some of the threads that you just sort of hinted at. Yeah.
I'll see if I can. I'll see if I can find time in front of a piano next time. We'll find
That'd be great. But you've got to show everyone on Feldenkrais first that wonderful film of your daughter climbing around on you while you're playing the
Oh,
piano. It's wonderful. I
what
have
is
to
good
comment.
posture at the piano? I'll
Andrew's
find
young
it.
daughter,
I have it in my computer for sure. I'll share it.
Andrew's young daughter comes in while he's playing and she's climbing up onto his shoulders or something. I don't remember exactly. And it doesn't affect the sound of what he's playing. And that is interesting. Okay, great. Great to talk.
All right, Roger. Great.
We'll see each other again, as the Germans say.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks so
Okay.
much.